So thanks a lot, Adrian. And I want to get you right to Paul as quickly as possible. And just note my delight in finally getting him here. We've been trying to get him here for about 2 years, repeatedly interrupted by COVID or other things. But Paul Engler, as you know from the bio, is a longtime activist. I don't know if in the bio you have the training as a therapist as well, but he is certainly a trained therapist. And he's applied his reflection over the last several years to the many pathologies of the American and other lefts around the world. He and his brother had a big breakthrough international event with a publication of their "This is an Uprising" analysis of structure versus other types, and they suggested the name momentum, of social movements that worked more nimbly with our current world of mass media and pop-up demonstrations and other things. He and his brother are regular, usually joint contributors in these times and The Nation, and I recommend that you look for their various reflections. Their work now on another book. You may tell us something about that, but we want to make sure that you understand the point of the first one starting out. So, Paul, take it away.
My nephew, when he was 4, he wanted attention and he would do this me dance. He didn't really know how to create a song, so his song went me. So I feel like it's a little bit of a me dance when people clap for me. Still not used to it. I'm going to tell you a little story about myself. And I do something called public narrative. Who here has ever heard of public narrative by Marshall Gantz or the Leading Change Network? Okay. When you're doing community organizing, I was trained in community organizing, and you show up at a door. When you're a therapist and a client comes in and says, "Why are you a therapist?" And, do you have a relationship with somebody or whatever? You like, why are you interested in knowing that about me? It's like you pathologize people asking questions. When you knock on a door, you have to tell people why in the hell you're at their door, or else they're not going to trust you, right? So a lot of doing that, building that trust is about, first, you have to say, who in the hell is this guy? Why do I actually care about him? And that isn't because of my book or whatever credibility my role, it's because of my story. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. So can we do a breath in? I want attunement, guys. Okay. Emotional attunement. Okay. Share my story. First thing I want to say is it was a lot of insecurity for me. I'm dyslexic, so I mispronounce words. I do a lot of things that seem funny. I had a lot of insecurity about it throughout my life. I'm going to talk a little bit about it, but you just have to have patience with me when I mispronounce words like electoral. Still messing with that word. What is it, Joel? What do I say?
Electoral.
Electoral. Okay. So I come from a very special family. My dad was a Roman Catholic priest, and my mom was a Franciscan nun, and they got together, okay? And anybody knows about Catholicism, that's not supposed to happen, okay? It was a forbidden love, okay? But at the time, that was common in the Catholic Church. There was a reform movement called post-Vatican II Peace and Justice Catholics, and a lot of priests, like a fourth of priests and nuns, left the church around that time in the late 60s, early 70s. And my parents were part of that movement, this reform movement of Peace and Justice Catholics. And I grew up in this counterculture. And my parents believed that they left the church, but they didn't fully leave their vocations, that their vocations came with them. Even if we were part of a little counterculture, and they had us, the products of forbidden love. Look at it. This is me in my outfit. This is my middle brother that I write with. This is my eldest brother. And look at those outfits. I did not dress myself. I can't take credit for it. My mother dressed me at this time, but it is fashionable, of course. Anyways, we grew up in going to these like base communities of small groups at church talking about social justice in the beloved community. And the beloved community was this idea, this radical Catholic idea that the last shall be first and the first shall be last, that the kingdom of God means that everyone voice will be heard, that divinity is in everybody. It's a radical vision of this new society. And we grew up with that. And that meant that we were raised in a different way. Even when I was very little, like 5 or 6, we would do activities like we'd have dinner every night and we pray. And my parents wanted me to pray too and say, what are you grateful for? I'm grateful for God for Spider-Man. My dad was like, yes, that's great. You know, we would get involved in family decision-making. My dad would have little meetings, family meetings, where our voices could be heard. And we went to soup kitchens, and my family was involved in these small group-based communities that were involved in the Latin American solidarity movement in the 80s. So I went to protest in different against the US government and against their involvement in Latin America. I went to union picket lines. All these things were part of what it meant to be part of my family. And I knew it was something special to be an Engler, which is my last name. Being an Engler boy was something very special. And we really held that very seriously. Like, okay, we are part of this vision of our family of being a beloved community. But a few things happened that were really, really challenging. One is that my father died very suddenly of a heart attack, and it was totally unexpected. He had some health problems, but he died. And my mom, at the time, my dad did social work and he did public housing. He did housing for the poor. He specialized in housing for refugees that were coming into Des Moines. And when he died, my mom, who had done childcare, had to go and get a job to provide for us. And she got a low-wage job at a nursing home. Like anybody here having a relative that works at like a nurse's aide or a nursing home? That experience? Yes. So my mom wasn't paid very much, and she really struggled with that transition to provide for us. And I was 9 at the time, and my eldest brother, in a lot of ways, took care of me, as well as my other brothers. And it was really hard. We didn't fit into the neighborhood either. I'm dyslexic, so I was always made fun of because I mispronounced words. And I went to special education class, where I felt so much shame around, and the other kids picked on me around that. So make a long story short, it was a lot of pain and a lot of, I guess I could say, trauma, and we didn't know how to process that. And there was a sense that vision of our family as a beloved community was not present for a while when we were really in grief for about 4 or 5 years. There is a memory that I have. I tell this story a lot, so I'm not sure how much is the story and how much is the memory, the myth of my family. But my mom called us together for a family meeting. And we hadn't had a family meeting for a really long time. And it was one of the first times I saw my mom be really vulnerable. And she breaks down in front of us and says, I'm really sorry that I cannot do this alone. It's very hard for me to hold this vision of the community that I thought we were building with your father. And I don't know what happened that day. I thought she was going to announce that somebody had died, but her opening up and then asking us, look, I can only do it with you guys, and I need you guys to participate. And I can make this house your kingdom. I can give you power over this house, but you guys have to build that vision. And my brothers and I took that very seriously. And a lot of the misfits of our community came to our house. So, and it was a real ragtag group of different people. It was one of the only Jewish kids in our neighborhood who had like what we called a Jew fro. He called it a Jew fro. He was in our crew. You know, it was the Argentinian foreign exchange student who was like, why in the hell did they send me to Des Moines, Iowa? You know, he just like felt tons of resentment around that. He was part of our group. It was a lot of young budding feminists in our crew. At first our crew was very against everything that the dominant culture was for, we were against. We all grew our hair out long. At a time I didn't wear deodorant. I was like, screw the man, you know, I was really angry, but we had this amazing sense of community. Our house was this amazing sense of community. And at first it was really oppositional, and we were only marginally political. I mean, we were kind of countercultural. And my brother, Francis, goes to college, and at college, they're represented by, the college he goes to is represented by the hotel and restaurant workers, Unite Here. Anybody ever heard of that union? Unite Here, hotel and restaurant workers. And they have a strike of the campus employees go on strike, and they recruit my brother and train my brother to be a labor and community organizer as a student at college. And he comes back and starts training me how to be a community organizer when I was still in high school. And there was this moment in my group of friends where our desire for power trumped our desire for self-righteousness and having a safe community, right? And a lot of this had to do with radical revolutionary discussions about student government. It was like, was high school student government a puppet democracy controlled by the dictatorship of our school administration, used to, you know, to extract free labor for school dances from the student body? That was one argument, the anarchist argument that thought we should take it over and destroy the institution, or should we take it over as a populist democratic front, right, of our radical beliefs? I was obviously on the side that we should take over student government. We ran a radical slate. We took over student government on a student power platform. I was the president, of course, you know, probably the tops of my popularity of all time in my life. And we started organizing, and it changed our life radically. And what we started learning from my brother, and then later when I went to college and became a student radical, is this amazing sense of how to build a bigger, more diverse community against the kids that we felt bullied us. Now we're part of our coalition in the student government. And I went all the way from feeling totally rejected, feeling like an idiot, feeling really insecure about my language learning disability, and having all this pain in my family, to being like, I just won the jackpot. Like, this community is amazing. Like, this is what I want to be. People would ask me in high school, what do you want to be? What do you want to be when you grow up? I was like, I want to be a student radical. You know, that was everything to me. And I grew up and I became a student radical. I went to college, and during that time, there was this thing called the Battle in Seattle. Who here knows about the Battle in Seattle, right? In the global justice movement. But before that happened, I started getting training during the summers at the hotel and restaurant workers. And what I learned at the hotel and restaurant workers was this tradition. I would add Jane McClevey here. Who knows Jane McClevey? You know, but there is a whole bunch of people that represent this tradition of organizing. And this is a science of organizing. And this is in the US, these are the people we look to as sort of the elders of that tradition in the United States. If you go to Scotland, it's probably going to be different. If you go to Barcelona, they have a different structured tradition. But a lot in the United States, we have these institutions that represent this. This is now it's called interfaith worker. No, this is called justice, light and power, or something like that. But anyways, there's these institutions, some of them now, these are old, but that represent this tradition. And this tradition is really a craft of organizing. It's like a science of how do we build organization. And when I was training this, I went to Los Angeles and was trained by Unite Here Local 11. And when they trained me in this, this is Ella Baker, Marshall Gantz, who I mentioned, Saul Alinsky. These are all these institutions that represented. There's training institutes that train. Midwest Academy is one of the ones that talk about this. People's Action. Who here has ever heard of People's Action? ICCI in Des Moines. Anybody ever heard of them? They're affiliated with People's Action. I don't know what the People Action group here. And is it? Do you guys people?
They're not really here.
Okay. So this form of organizing builds organizations through deep relationships, through building leaders in workplaces and in the community, in neighborhoods, in any institution. And a lot of that is based on what they call house visits or one-on-one meetings. And when I was trained in this, I had a master. It was like an apprenticeship master relationship of this woman that I love very deeply. Her name is Martha Santa Maria, but she also plagues my nightmares because I still have her like barking orders at me. This is how you do things, because the training was so intense. And one of the things I tell this story every once in a while, I just said it this breakfast, I told this story is the first day I was a paid organizer, a worker organizer, I was getting trained by them. She brings me into a room. It's very anxiety provoking. She says, I want you to write your job description because I don't want you doing anything outside your job description. Okay, so I'm writing I'm gonna give you as much time as you want. Write everything that's in your job description. Okay, so I'm like writing. I'm trying to think of everything. What does a union organizer do? Just grievances. Does this? Does this? Does this? She comes back 45 minutes later. And I hand it to her. I'm like, I hope this is okay, right? She takes it. She's like, this is crap. She like rips it up, throws it in the wastebasket. She says, the only thing in your job description is 4 things: map, target, recruit, and train leaders. And the rest is all an intellectual exercise. If the leaders have power in the organization, if they know how to be leaders, if you train them, everything else comes from that. All the power comes from that. All the solutions get solved. So the craft of doing that, of developing what indigenous or rank and file leaders or different ways of talking about it, is a lot about how do you have deep one-on-one meetings? How do you mobilize people through a structure? That's when we say structure, is how these leaders are in a structure and they relationally move people through an organization. And a lot of times they have these meetings where they mobilize tons of people to a specific meeting to leverage it against a decision maker. So they use the leverage of the power of the organization. And we see this a lot in unions, right? And so this is the way I thought I was organizing. I learned the science of organizing through structure-based organizing, okay? Structure-based organizing. Let's just think about that. Structure-based, everyone say it to themselves. Structure-based organizing. This is like a memory and coding thing. Go ahead.
Paul, could I encourage you to tell them where to stand so we keep him in the.
Just as long as you don't go in front of the.
Okay, yeah.
Okay. All right.
It's faith in action.
Faith in action. Yes, thank you. So I was learning the science of organizing. It was so incredibly powerful. It had changed my life. It had built this amazing community in my hometown where I grew up. And just being able to have this tool, I was able to go to my college campus and build a group by developing leaders in the college. And our group was called Student Action. And I was mobilizing, I was starting to mobilize during this thing called the Battle in Seattle that exploded. And something happened that was outside of anything that I was taught. I didn't even understand what the fuck was happening. It was like all of a sudden there was this moment and tons of people were interested in the cause. At the time we were into anti-sweatshop stuff. So we were trying to fight for our college to have better apparel that wasn't made in sweatshops. And we were what they called us anti-globalization protesters, but we called ourselves global justice organizers. We were offended if you call us anti-globalization protesters. We were global justice organizers. And anyways, when the Battle in Seattle happened, it created this amazing thing. Later on, my brother and I coined the term, we borrowed it actually from Saul Alinsky, the moment of the whirlwind, which is these moments where the rules of organizing dramatically changed. And for me, it happened when I was planning the first protest, the first meeting to plan a protest against the World Bank and IMF in the basement of a church. And I hadn't done all the things that the science of organizing had taught me to do, which is mobilize one-on-one through relationships. So I just assumed that like 4 or 5 people were going to show up at this meeting at this church, but we advertised it online. We advertised it through little leaflets or something, and hundreds of people showed up in the basement of the church. And we had no idea where they came from, not from our leadership, not from our structure. They just showed up. And we're like, holy shit, this is like magic. Like, what has happened? And that was just the beginning of all these events that introduced me to a radically different tradition. And this tradition is more like concert promotion. We call this mass protest tradition. So let's say it to ourselves, just remember, mass protest tradition. So the mass protest tradition is represented by different training institutes and different organizations. And they are trying to mobilize outside of structures, right? Or through structures that they don't necessarily build up. And there is other people like George Lakey or Francis Fox Piven is an intellectual of this tradition, or Lisa Fithian that goes around and plans these big direct actions. And this is what the nonviolence tradition in the civil rights movement really represented this. Now, there was a tension in the civil rights movement between these two models of organizing, between the Ella Bakers and the more like James Lawsons and the James Bevels and the Martin Luther Kings, a lot of times represented the mass protest tradition. And there was tension between these two traditions because mass protest tradition is a lot about, has a different theory of change, it has different tactics, different organizations, and different ways of measuring success, okay, than the structure base. But they both have really powerful gifts in getting people to participate and be activated. And the mass protest tradition is more about how do we create actions at scale? How do we scale up? How do we create what we call moments of the whirlwind and trigger events? How do we create these trigger events that catapult us into the media and then absorb that energy into temporary organizations? So if I would say mass protests, what are things in the United States that you guys have seen that fit that definition of mass protests? Throw it out there, just yell it out. Women's March, great, perfect example.
Black Lives Matter.
Black Lives Matter, what else?
Iraq war protest.
Iraq war protest, great. What else?
Climate justice.
Some climate justice, you're right. So we learn this tradition and we realize that this tradition, this science of organizing with a theory of change, tactics, organizations that we had learned from these people. She was a mentor of mine, Lisa Fithian, George Lakey, I consider an elder and a mentor. They taught us a whole bunch of skills that were different than our structure-based tradition. And that there was tons of tension between these two things. One knew how to scale and how to absorb energy and how to polarize and create big trigger events and change public opinion very quickly. The other one knew how to build very stable organizations, right? And they both had strengths and weaknesses. But what we realized is we needed something after we were organizing high levels of momentum within the mass protest movement. First, in the global justice movement, 9/11 happened and the movement imploded almost overnight. The momentum was dead. And organizing, when you don't have momentum, when you don't have, you can't capture the media spotlight, you don't have credibility, it's not in the public consciousness, it's very hard to do mass protests. And I say that the movement imploded, but emotionally, it's not just a concept. It means your whole community implodes. It means your heart implodes because you're part of this movement and then it doesn't exist anymore. People aren't showing up. The organizations can't raise money. You can't, all the things that make that movement work no longer exist. And it was very, very painful to us. But we realized that this happens again and again and again. And also the model of mass protests, of how we do that in the United States, is very repetitive. There's a lot of things this tradition does in the United States. Some of them are like large group consensus decision-making. Who here has ever been part of a large group consensus decision-making process, okay? Occupy, right, did that. Affinity groups here has been part of an affinity group. You ever experienced this? Those are part of that tradition and that models, how to do a lot of that stuff, how to plan really complex, we call action scenarios, right? And to actually what we call front load in action, front load one action and then pump the hell out of it, do like concert promotion and getting lots of people involved in the action. So that's very hard to do when you don't have momentum, when you don't have the media spotlight. When the trigger event is over, after a while, the cycle implodes. And for us, we realized that trigger events and moments of the whirlwind are actually happening all the time. But we had to figure out a new model of doing that in the United States. And so we started studying different ways of doing mass protests. And we met this guy. His name is Ivan Marovic, and he was the leader of Otpor. He was one of the leaders of Otpor, which was a student movement in Serbia that overthrew Slobodan Milosevic, and they created a model. And their model was a hybrid. It was a hybrid between structure and mass protest, and it was doing mass protests in a totally different way. They were one of the first people that started studying decentralization. How do you do decentralization in a complex way? How do you scale things? How do you keep the quality of the culture, of the story, of the actions, of the tactics, of the strategy, which we call the organizational DNA? How do you keep that in its high level of quality when it scales? Does that make sense? Makes sense, raise your hand. Yes. So we were like, wow, these Serbian revolutionaries know what they're talking about. We want to bring this model to the United States. And so we started experimenting with that. We did a lot of that within the immigrant rights movement. In 2006, there was a huge moment of the whirlwind within the immigrant rights movement. And when we say hybrid, so there's different organizing traditions and different types of movements that are trying to do different things. They have different theories of change. They have different ways of changing the world. There are countercultural movements, and we call those alternatives. And there's electoral movements like Bernie Sanders, right? That was sort of electoral movement. There's mass protest movements. There's structure. They're not really structure movements, but there's structures. I guess the labor movement would kind of be a structure movement. And then there's personal transformative stuff. That would be like 12-step or AA, right? And each of them can build movements in different ways. But what we thought was missing in the United States is a different model of this. How do we make a better mass protest movement? So we experimented with that. And the first thing we had to realize is there's a science to this stuff. We have to study it. We have to have a better theory. And one of the things we learned from the Serbian revolutionaries is most of the debates that happen in a movement are because people actually don't have a theory of change. They don't actually know how change happens. They fight because they're fighting because they actually represent different theories of change. Some people are there because they want to change themselves and they want to change other people personally. Other people are there because, and this happened in Occupy, the occupation is the revolution. Who here saw that in Occupy, right? People fight for the occupation itself being the transformative change. They don't care about changing dominant institutions as much. Some people from that theory of change. And then the mass protest people are like, how do we change the public? How do we polarize? How do we gain public opinion? And they're not as interested in actually leveraging that to win things immediately. They're more about how do we win the public, targeting the public. And then structure is about how do we build a base to actually have power, right? Electoral or the inside game is more about how do we take state power. In Occupy, they weren't interested primarily in taking state power, right? It was mostly mass protests and alternatives. So we're like, how do we create something that fits into this movement ecology that's better? We have to study the science. And if we get everyone to really understand that mass protest is about winning the public. It's about polarizing the public in a way that moves people towards us to create a big movement of people that support us. If we can get them bought onto that, then almost all the strategic debates go away instantly because now people have the same strategy. They have the same theory about how to create change. So we started studying the science of mass protest movements, which is loosely called civil resistance. It's strategic nonviolence. And we used that science and all these people that were sort of experts in creating this science, translated into popular education so that movements, everyone that joins the movement gets trained on the strategy. Like popular education. So everyone that gets initiated and starts participating in the mass protest movement knows why they're doing it and how they're creating change. And these are some of the big institutions that study this science of civil resistance, which we used in the formation of what we call momentum, okay? And at the same time, we were very influenced by this guy, Marshall Gantz, who systematized structure-based organizing. And he did it for Obama. For the early days in 2008, Marshall Gantz was the architect of the training program for the grassroots organizing within the Obama campaign. And they developed a mass training program called Camp Obama, where people would go for a weekend or so and do trainings. And 42,000 people did that training. And they were trained in the basics of public narrative and structure-based organizing. And because of that, they had this army of amazing grassroots organizers that was part of that campaign. And they beat Hillary Clinton, who had a hell of a lot more money and structure and credibility in a lot of ways. So we learned a lot about that. One of my work partners, Carlos Saavedra, replicated some of that within the DREAM movement, within the immigrant rights movement. And he created a very similar like training for public narrative for dreamers that created this amazing scalable movement and pipeline for great leaders within the DREAM movement. And after the DREAM movement sort of collapsed, they had done trainings for 8,000 people in these weekend trainings for public narrative. But the movement collapsed when they actually won DACA. They won the legal right for dreamers to be in the United States and have papers and to be able to work and stuff. So Carlos now, he was in this sad place of being like, oh, my movement has collapsed. We just won. The organization wasn't doing well. And so me and Carlos and a whole bunch of people from different movements, early Black Lives Matter, at the time it wasn't Black Lives Matter, it was the Trayvon Martin, it was Dream Defenders who had done organizing around Trayvon Martin. It was immigrant rights, a lot of dreamers, a lot of people from the Jewish community, the progressive Jewish community, and people from the climate justice movement, or that was working on climate change. We formed this core that launched this training institute to try to create a new model of mass protest movements with the idea that we can build movements that create trigger events and moments of the whirlwind. We can take the best practices of the science and the best practices of other movements all across the globe, and we can figure out how to build a better model in the United States. And then I wrote a book called This is the Uprising. And what happened, this book was a lot more successful, to be honest, than I expected, because it's kind of a geeky book. Like, not that many people are geeky. You know, not many people want to read geeky books, but it really took off because a lot of people wanted to understand how do we build better mass protest movements. And it became a bestseller in Catalonia around the independence movement. It became the Hong Kong, the umbrella movement in Hong Kong, they translated into Chinese, loved this book. They did a lot in their movement about promoting the book, and it sold more copies than we expected. And momentum began to incubate these new movements. Cosecha, If Not Now, Sunrise were all part of our incubation process at Momentum that launched. And then we realized that we were launching all these mass protest movements, but we didn't have a vision. Some people in Momentum broke off and wanted to create something new. Part of that was Black Momentum, which was a training that did a lot of training in the Black Lives Matter space. And then some people broke off and created a lot of theory about how do we think about inside game? How do we think about realignment and electoral stuff? Because how do we translate this mass protest movement into real state power? And they created All of Us, which then merged and created Justice Democrats and AOC. So a lot of leaders, some of the leaders in Momentum, not me, went off and sort of created a lot of that. So one of the things just to notice that really changed everything is understanding how social change happens with these trigger events and these moments of the whirlwind. that they're not just flukes, historical flukes, that they're happening all the time. And if we are ready and prepared and movements know how to use them, it can change everything. And if you look at public opinion through time, what you see is that it looks like a line, but the reality of it, public opinion shifts dramatically up and down. And that is directly correlated to, let me get a graph. This is the civil rights movement where, well, I think I have it. I have one around civil rights movement. This is public opinion around race relations. These ups and downs are directly correlated to these big protest moments. Throughout, this is like 1948 to 2014, about whether or not people think race is the most important thing. Public opinion dramatically changes in these little tiny windows. Each one of these was in a trigger event with the civil rights movement, whether it was the Brown versus the Board of Education and protests around desegregated schools, and the early civil rights movement, the student sit-ins and March on Washington and Birmingham, all these things are correlated to these big spikes. But if you win enough, which is what happened with same-sex marriage, everything changes once you win enough public opinion. But it's not just passive support, you have to get active support too. And what it means by active support is Erica Chenoweth, who here knows about big data? Big data, which is you put huge data sets that helps you analyze things like medical procedures or therapy or sports, right? You have all this data around football, and then you can be really good at winning fantasy football, right? Well, there's big data within social movements developed by this woman, Erica Chenoweth, that created this huge database of nonviolent mass protest movements in other countries. And what she was able to create some understandings that we didn't really know before through just feeding in all this data that the military had been doing for many, many years in military interventions, which is they put all this data in about who was in the conflict, how many resources they had, what tactics they did, all these different things. They put it into a database and they can crunch some numbers. And one of the things that and how many people participate and what the organization is, she puts a lot of the data in. And what she realizes, after 3.5% of a population starts getting involved, almost zero authoritarian or dictatorship could survive. The regime always fell if 3.5% of the population participated, right? So if you get a majority, if you polarize and you create a majority of passive support, and then you're able to mobilize so that 3.5% of your population starts getting involved in protests, general strikes, they start voting as a bloc, things like that, the regime has a hard time staying in power. In the United States, that looks a little different because we live in a democracy, but still there's tremendous power once you hit that critical mass. And what does it is not structure-based organizing. What does it is mass protest movements are the ones that are able to get that amount of critical mass of people. Whenever we do presentations, now Momentum, I've done dozens and dozens and dozens of trainings, and I ask activists in a room like this, how did they get involved? It's almost always through a mass protest movement. If I did it to the labor movement, if I did it to hotel and restaurant workers in Los Angeles, 90% of them would raise their hand and said, an organizer came to my door and knocked on my door. Or I was in my workplace and another worker took me aside during my coffee break. They might have that story. But for most people, especially students and especially just general people in the public, it's through the battle in Seattle, Occupy, or the Women's March that they first get involved and they start becoming radicalized and they start participating. And so we're like, okay, how do we put that in a bottle? How do we take this science, put it in a bottle so that we can create a model that constantly creates these moments of the whirlwind that can change history as we know it? Because the reality of it is the zombies are coming. Sorry to tell you, the zombies are, our culture is falling apart, our environment is falling apart, our economy is falling apart, right? This is how change is going to happen. We need this. We also need structure, but we need a different model of this. And when we say the hybrid, what we're talking about a lot of times is how do we bring the best elements of structure to create a structure that can do mass protest so they can work together so we can stop the zombies. All right? Exciting? You want to be part of it? I'm recruiting you afterwards, okay? No, that you're not. You're still kind of low. Yeah, okay. Okay. Who here has read my book? Wow. Okay. Who here knows about my book? Before I just said it, who here wants to buy my book? This is a comfortable question because I have books. I'll sell them for super cheap. For $5, I'll sell you a hardcover copy. My mother wanted to get rid of some of her books, and she's giving them to you actually for very cheap. Okay, so afterwards I'll have some books, but that's my talk. How
As
long was
an
it?
individual that started, I came of age a little older than you are in the late 60s when I was in college and got very involved in the anti-war movement, civil rights, women's, it all came at that time. And we used many of the same organizing things. And I found that after I got out of college in 71, went to grad school for one semester, and I became so jaded that I kind of left it.
Yeah.
And my conclusion is I had to go back to some kind of grassroots because the big changes that I visualized and I felt like my cohort did in our actions were not going to come until we had fundamental changes at the base of how we conduct our lives. And I still have, I kind of came back to it, and I'm pretty active in the climate movement and such as that. But do you see an ultimate change that would basically reorder societies to a point where we really can come to be, in harmony with our environment and each other in communities? Because as you just ended on, we're not there. In fact, we're hurtling to a really bad end.
What I do know is this. There is an advantage with the fact that there is no alternative. The movements are going to grow. We're going to go through in the next 20, 30 years, some of the biggest movement activity in the history of the world. We've already have. Trump was the Women's March and protests that was happening during the Trump years were the biggest level of mobilization in the United States of people to protest ever in American history. And we're going to go through more waves of that. I guarantee it. Why? Because the zombies are coming. There's no option. Like climate change is going to get a lot worse. I think the economy is going to get a lot worse. When I go around and do presentations to high schoolers or even college students, when we were studying Robert Putnam and these other experts on the nature of community now and how it's progressed, there's something that is in the air that I think is part of like the Bernie Sanders phenomenon, is that throughout American history, every single generation felt that they were doing better than their parents. And if you didn't, it sort of challenges your sense of hope for your life. It creates a lot of despair if you feel that the chances are that you will do worse than your parents. And economically, that was the case for most of American history. It's not the case now. Your generation is probably going to do worse than your parents. And that is depressing. And there is advantages to that because now more people are activated. But it's not. I have moments of despair because these mass protests come and go. And right now we're in a lull.
When you say do worse, you're talking
economically. And I'm not even talking about climate change, which is a whole nother thing.
And mentally.
Yes.
We
That
might
too.
do better. I mean,
well, actually, suicide rates are going way up. Depression and anxiety is going up. Right now, 1/6 to 1/5 of the American population is taking psychotropic drugs. which is more than ever before, which means that they have to have a chronic mental health problem to be diagnosed. I mean, that's a pretty dreary view of our society, that a quarter of the population is experiencing intense anxiety and depression of some sort. Like, our culture is falling apart. Lots of things aren't working. And I think that creates an opportunity that people want something different. And I think that's going to come. What I'm very interested in is this social movement ecology. And what I mean by this is that the civil rights movement, one of the reasons it did so well is that it had an amazing mass protest tradition. That's true. But it also had a lot of other pieces of the ecology. The Black church was an amazing alternative for Black people in the South. It was a huge institution that could be mobilized for the mass protest movement. And it created an alternative culture. Movements that do really well for over decades, like the landless peasant movement in Brazil, or we call the MST, Movimento Sem Terra. I don't know the Portuguese translation, but something around there. It's because they work on each piece of that ecology. When the mass protest movement explodes, they absorb that and they absorb them into structures of people being involved in a union or being involved in a neighborhood group or being involved in an encampment. And those encampments last longer than the ups and downs of the movement. And they absorb them into a counterculture. Like in the Indian independence movement, they had they broke the movement up into 3 camps. Satyagraha, which was the mass protest, the Indian National Congress, which was their unions and political parties, and then what they called the constructive campaign, which was the counterculture. And everyone would drop everything to do mass protests. They would absorb the energy. And when the mass protests collapsed, everyone would go into the alternatives, the constructive program, or into the electoral stuff. And I think the interrelationship of those things is what makes us create an incredible movement that can save the world as we know it. It's the combination of those types of change. What we were interested in this book, what I'm talking to you about, is how do we do mass protests better by combining mass protest and structure. But I think the keys to the revolution is how to do these models that are interdependent within the movement ecology.
So I'm just interested in, at a technical level, what you would suggest about how to think about strategy. So just say, for example, that the people in this room would come to you and say, we want to set up a social movement around an issue. What is the sort of 5-step or 10-step plan? What would you walk people through initially in just terms of teaching them how to develop a hybrid of mass and structure-based organizing?
Well, the first thing to do is realize what do you actually want to build? Do you want to build a mass protest movement? Do you want to build a union? Do you want to build a neighborhood group? And each of those have different ways of thinking about stuff. If you came to me and you said, I want to do a mass protest movement, I would advise you to go to Momentum and they could help you front load a movement. And what they do in what we call front loading, which is their process of launching a movement, is they do lots and lots of mass training, kind of like the Camp Obama, but they do that around mass protests, training you in the theories of what makes the mass protest movement work, which is primarily how do you create big trigger events? How do you polarize and absorb that momentum? We call it the escalation cycle, and getting everyone into that cycle of momentum, of escalation and absorption, and the creation of polarization, which creates active support that can be mobilized. And then, so you develop what we call a story, strategy, structure, which is the DNA of the movement. You create a movement DNA, and you spend years working that out in a small group. And then you launch actions that try to create trigger events. And then once you hit one out of the park, you get a trigger event, then you absorb that into this organization that we help you develop, like an idea of how to build those organizations. And the organization of mass protest movements are more decentralized, and they could absorb people very easily around a common DNA. So they're taught very quickly. What is the goals of the movement, the strategy of the movement, the story of the movement, and the structure of the movement. This happened a little bit in Occupy, but it was primarily just an action. But when people went to the general assemblies, they learned the culture of the movement, and they absorb it uncritically in the first week of participating in the movement generally. a lot of the DNA. And so you have to be very intentional about front loading the DNA before you launch it with the mass protest movement. If you wanted to form a union, I'd send you to a union that's really good at doing structure-based organizing, whether it's Unite Here, or there's good organizers in SEIU, there's some good organizers in UE, United Electrical Workers, there's 1199 SEIU. There are still pockets of really powerful organizing, but unfortunately, most of the labor movement doesn't know how to organize anymore. There's only a small pocket, but those pockets are very powerful and they can teach you how to organize. And they're organizing right now, Starbucks workers and Amazon workers. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Yeah, kind of going off of that, I think this idea of sort of hybridity, DNA, combining these two traditions, I think that's awesome. It's indeed a revelation. I just have a question with regard to the sort of organizational rift you'll be having, because a lot of times in history, people share, that's about, ideological variances. I mean, two organizations might even share like similar particular agendas. It just terms of organizations, like these are two different groups of people. So I was just curious, like what were some of your experiences in dealing with that organizational rift, or do you thoughts just as long as we have that sort of common formula of blueprint, that's going to work?
Yes. So when you front load, you need to get your theory of change and your strategy right at the very beginning. How detailed it is a big debate. But if you don't win alignment on that, when people are coming for Occupy, for instance, what were people coming to do? What was the objective of Occupy? Well, if you talk to different people in Occupy, they're going to have very different ideas. But the only thing they agreed to was the story and the occupation, right? And then once the occupation is over, it's a shit show of internal battles of the left. It's like everyone's fighting for the new vision, the new DNA. And so when you front load, once you get the strategy and the theory right, and the strategy doesn't need to be that specific, but if you have at least alignment around that, it's a lot easier then to navigate what's going to happen next. But I want to tell you, the left in the United States right now is in a lull, and it is not a healthy culture at the left. I'm not going to get into details about that, but it is the most decisive I've ever seen it. I got a call from this woman, Barbara Epstein, when a little after Trump was elected, 2 years after Trump was elected. And she studies, Barbara Epstein is a professor at UC Santa Barbara, I think. She studies these movement cycles, and she studied the cycles between 68 and 74. And she was like, this cycle that we're in is worse than that cycle, in that our movements right now are very toxic. There's a lot of really hard stuff to work through. That is a natural product of having some of the highest momentum that we've ever had in American history. And now we're on the lull, and there's lots of different sectarian battles and struggles, and lots of people that are mentioning that around what I call neoliberal identitarianism, around not having alignment even about what it is to be a leftist, right? Are really being fought out in a way that isn't healthy in a lot of organizations. Maurice Mitchell, I don't know if you just wrote a piece. He's the executive director of Working Families Party that I think is one of the best pieces about sort of that tension that is happening in almost all progressive organizations and leftist spaces right now.
So Paul, I have a question from the chat, and then I will call on somebody in our virtual audience. The first question from the chat is from Greg. He writes, the world is more interconnected now than in previous eras. Might the protest currently happening in Europe be able to influence this country? So what do you think about, I'm going to call it protest contagion, or is there momentum that can be built from something like that?
There is a lot of people that were writing in the last 10 years about the Twitter revolution or Facebook, when the Egyptian revolution happened, there was this book called the Facebook revolution, right? And these are like people that are really into technology, and they're like, technology is going to change everything, right? And I do have to say, it does affect certain things. It does allow for mass protest movements to absorb momentum a lot easier, to get resources. If you hit one out of the park and you do a trigger event, you do a mass protest, you get on front page New York Times or whatever, it goes viral a lot faster, and a lot of people can connect to you instantly. You can create an email list instantly. You can create a Facebook group instantly with tens of thousands of people that are interested in getting involved. That changes the equation. It allows Bernie Sanders to raise tens of millions of dollars when he couldn't before, right? Because the movement now can raise money off their email list and stuff. So it does, the viral interconnectedness does help mass protest movements. It does help us, but it doesn't change the basic science. You still have to do the organizing. You still have to do the front loading. You still have to do all the things that make it have to work. And you still have to create the actions that create the trigger event. It just creates like a better feedback loop. In the civil rights movement, during the Birmingham campaign, everyone see the pictures of the police dogs going, biting black protesters in Birmingham, and the fire hoses that are etched in the memory of American history. Everybody familiar with those things? When those hit the front page of New York Times and every major news channel, and everyone watched national news at that time, there was really only like 4 channels. Millions of people wanted to support the civil rights movement, but how in the hell are they going to get people to even send money? No one knows where to even send the money. There's no address. They put an ad in the New York Times a week after the action, and people wrote, they raised like $1 million, which in today's world would be even more, by people writing in little messages, handwritten letters to send donations from a New York Times ad. How inefficient is that compared to just seeing it, being able to click, getting a mass email, and then being able to click that you're going to give money? It's so much more efficient.
I have a question from Anita Samansky. Anita, if you would turn on your camera, and I will ask you to unmute, and you can ask your question.
So this is related to what you've been talking about, but in these massive trigger event mobilizations, like for example, in Israel right now. And I also think about what happened here in Madison in 2011. There are groups within the huge mobilization. There are groups that are working for longer term goals. There are groups that are working to, for example, in Israel, can this be pushed forward towards demands to end the occupation and other demands beyond just the most immediate thing? Can you speak at all about what would it take? What are the possibilities? What are things that strengthen the possibility? What could it look like if, when so many people are so mobilized and really not ready to just turn around and go back to their lives, to move that forward into a movement?
Thanks, Anita.
There's something that's very unique about mass protest movements that very few people talk about. And in civil resistance, this is talked about as like disobedient civil society. That's the technical term in civil resistance. And it happens in the labor movement when you have multiple cycles within an industry, like the hotel industry in New York has been on many strikes. And so those workers, when you mess with them, when they're fighting for something, they go on a strike like almost instantly, and 99% of the workers go out on strike, and they can call a strike in a week, and all the workers go out on strike, right? Howard Zinn, the great US historian, talked about this moment in US history in '68 where he calls it surprises. Like all these things started happening during this moment because so many people were activated that new movements started sparking up in ways that no one expected. In the Native American or the Indian, what's it called? The Indian, American Indian movement, right? Is one of them he talks about. The feminist movement, had all these different explosions and trigger events that were randomly coming up without that much organization. When a moment of the whirlwind happens over and over and over again, you can get this activated base, which maybe not 3.5%, but is enough, where then you can do a lot of things that you could never imagine before. Like in Poland, Solidaire got to a point where it could call general strikes and the population would respond. They would do general strike after general strike after general strike in a period of 3 years. That only happens if you build the repertoire of people doing large scale, direct, nonviolent action over and over again and seeing that it's successful. Then you have this activated base. When you talk to people, I have talked to different activists in the South African anti-apartheid movement. In the last 2 years of that movement, they got to a place like that, where the movement became so powerful and so activated that they could call general strikes, they could call mass boycotts, and the public would respond without as much organizing. That's the possibility that the left has that is possible. Now, is it very hard to get there? Yes. But we've seen that that phenomena has happened in history, and we see it in other countries. I think that's one of the shining examples of the promised land, of something we might be able to get to if we build powerful enough mass protest movements.
Thank you very much. Paul, I'm going to take a question from the chat from first, there are now a flurry of hands or questions in the chat, but this first one I'm going to give you is from Giuseppe Lacari, who is joining us from Italy. He is a PhD student at the Scuola Normale. Apologies, Giuseppe, if I'm butchering that. He says, thank you very much for the presentation. The most recent literature on the labor movement is showing renewed trends of protests both traditionally developed countries and in countries that developed quite quickly over the last few decades. You feel that the comeback of class struggles has had an impact on your work in the US, and how do you think it could be harmonized with, or has it even empowered other progressive components of social movements, such as the ones for climate justice or for civil rights?
After the Flint sit-down strikes in the 30s, there was spontaneous sit-down strikes in tons of different industries that were not centrally coordinated by any union. And a lot of workers, huge amounts, 500,000 workers were organized in a 6-month period. That was not organized through structure. That was organized through mass protests, right? We've never gotten there in the United States. We've never gotten to a place where we create enough of a mass protest movement that people can join unions and really have a strong union, because our labor laws suck so bad. It's so hard to form a union that can actually fight and win a first contract without being destroyed by the employer. So there's a debate in the labor movement, which is, do we do the old model of organizing through hardcore structure, or can we do other models that are based on momentum? Because there's so much momentum, especially with young workers at Starbucks, that they can organize. They're like hot shops. That's what we call them. There's so many hot shops that maybe we can give the tools away and those people can organize, or maybe there's different models where we can support hot shop organizing. I'm still under the belief that even though there's a lot more hot shops, there's a lot more people that want to organize unions now, we still don't have a critical mass of energy that still takes old school structure-based organizing to win campaigns. Even in Starbucks, it's easier to get into those campaigns, but you need the support of a labor union that knows how to organize and all the legal support and all that. There is a debate in the labor movement because there is people experimenting with more decentralized models. The Writers Guild is doing really interesting work of decentralized organizing and have been really successful at just giving tools out and allowing sort of independent organizing. But I don't think there is a mass unionization effort that I believe is going to break through in the next few years, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you for that inspiring response. Next, we'll go to Pablo, who asks, any experience or comment on how to produce positive and complementary work for social change between social movements and social movement influenced governments, where former activists of social movements have reached government, for example?
This is our next book. My brother and I are writing our next book. We talk about the inside outside game. How do you have a movement that's on the outside of politics, and how do you have the actual progressives? And we've seen in the United States, the progressive prosecutor movement. I don't know if you call it a movement, but there's been a lot of progressive prosecutors that have been catapulted into office, partly through Black Lives Matter, right? Partly through the movement. Larry Krasner is the most prominent one in Philly. He's actually, my brother was arrested during the global justice movement protests of the Republican National Convention. Larry Krasner represented the activists in suing the police department. And so we know him, like I've met him before, in movement circuit. He represented the movements as a movement lawyer. And now he's the DA of Philly, right? He's like a movement dude. So this question of how do movements come into power and do what we call co-governance. So we wrote a report about co-governance in these times. If you go to thisisanuprising.org, you can see our co-governance report, but it's really talking about how do we do inside outside work? How do they work together? We're very inspired by El Común. I'm sorry if I'm butchering the name because it's in Catalan, and Ada Colau, who's the mayor of Barcelona. And they did a process, which she was the leader of the anti-evictions movement and the Occupy movement, that kind of Occupy-like the movement in anti-austerity movement in Spain, in Barcelona. And then she became the mayor, right? And so they had a huge process of trying to create a party and a movement that was holding the electoral work. And it's really challenging because there's tensions between the inside game and the outside game. And how to do that is very challenging. One of the biggest inspirations of how to do that, we think, is the MST, the Landless Peasant Movement in Brazil. They run, I think, schools for like 300,000 young people in rural areas are actually schools run by the movement, but they take public money. They basically run public schools in rural areas, and they run these public schools as radical revolutionary training grounds for young people in these rural areas. And it is amazing. And we think that's an interesting model. It's like, how do movements take over city governments, take over state governments, and use them in ways that are really powerful for movements? And that's what our next book is about.
I guess, I think it's been talked about a little bit, but sort of like avoiding co-optation of the movements. Like there was the picture of young Obama and I came up growing up, like really excited about him, but then kind of seeing him ascend to the presidency and doing a lot of things that were in favor of corporations rather than working people, and kind of, being pretty disheartened by that. So like, how do you make sure that it's like you stick with your values and you stick with, I know you said like strategy, story, structure, but it could be really disheartening for people when they work for something and they believe in it and they see it gets co-opted and corporatized. And I think that happens a lot with nonprofits too. So I guess your thoughts on that.
Just wrote an article, this just came out. Culture eats strategy for breakfast, meaning that the organizational culture that you're in, whether it's a tenant rights organization or people's action or a structure-based union, you really can't do anything outside of the culture of that union, right? It's like, and we absorb those cultures and we don't even realize it. That is a good thing and it's a really bad thing. It's both, because if you have a good culture, you replicate the culture and people do good things within that culture. If it's a bad culture, you replicate the culture and people do bad things because of that culture. It's hard for politicians, even really good politicians, to realize that they get co-opted because they go in and they have to play the game to get power. And to play the game, they lose their soul. They don't realize they're doing it. And a lot of times it's very hard for them not to, because the culture that surrounds them and that maintains them in power is for them to basically sell out in different ways. And so really the only option we see is that the movement has to think very consciously about how to create parallel structures to support these candidates so that they can survive. And I think Joel in Cows, right, is part of that, is that they need a vision that's an alternative vision for how to use municipal power, state power. They also need staffing from social movements, right? They need people that are not just the standard Democrats or neoliberal people advising them on policy. They need a lot of different things. We break that down into, different categories of what they need so that they don't sell out. And we use the work of Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman. And he sort of talks about that in the media. How is it that all these mainstream media people go into these institutions like the New York Times and they just represent the neoliberal consensus? They become co-opted by the mainstream media. We think that same model applies to politicians. It's not just saying that it's inevitable. It's saying that there are structures that are the reason. And it's really interesting because when you have somebody like Ada Colau in Barcelona, or you have people like Harold Washington, who was this civil rights sort of mayor that basically destroyed the old democratic machine, the Daley machine in the 80s in Chicago. They were able to build a parallel structure that addressed a lot of the things that we mention with the machine. So the machine had ways of raising money. They built an alternative ways of raising money. The machine had ways to create flack, to attack people who were outside the norm. They created alternative flack. So there was a lot of things bureaucracy. The machine had their own state bureaucracies. When Harold Washington came into power, the bureaucracy of the city government defected against the movement candidate, and a lot of people didn't even show up to work. He fired thousands of city employees, or hundreds, I think it was thousands, but of city employees, and put in a new bureaucracy. Same thing with Ada Colau. See, the bureaucracy rebelled. She was able to build relationships and build an alternative bureaucracy. So there's all these different things that need to happen, but it never happens unless you have a vision of doing that. Because if you don't have the vision of doing that and you don't see the possibilities of doing the alternative, you always fall into the limits of trying to win things through compromise.
I'll ask a question from Peter Blankenheim, and you already touched on it a little bit, but Peter asks, is society ready for a phase change and how internet connectivity affects social change? So far, social media has encouraged more tribalism. High-powered quants in presidential campaign were counterproductive, but with some tinkering, maybe borrowing ideas from crypto, it seems we could create some instruments that would be really powerful at empowering both domestically and internationally.
Well, I just want to say, the ideas of decentralization are very powerful. And I think crypto kind of, in some ways, got people really excited about decentralization. I think most people, though, that are in that crypto movement are libertarian people that want to make a buck off of economic speculation. That's my opinion. I don't know, maybe there is very good progressive applications to crypto. And Michelle Bowens at P2P, I think, has a really interesting analysis of how that could be used, how crypto and those technologies can be used to build alternative economic structures and all this stuff. So I'm not an expert at that. I sort of defer to him. I think you guys had him come, right?
Yeah.
I love that dude. But anyways, maybe I'll get myself in trouble saying I love Michelle Bowen. But anyways, I think that people want a golden bullet for the revolution. And I don't think there's a golden bullet. I don't think there's one thing. And I don't think technology is going to radically change how we organize. I don't. I think it's going to elevate what we already know works really well. And certain things like mass protest absorption and decentralization helps mass protest organizing. But it doesn't help structure that much. And we still need those different things. We need people who are going to really build long-term communities. We need unions. We need structures to be able to do that. But I do think that there is potential now in ways there wasn't. And we see that when there's natural disasters in other countries now, we see that there's a mobilization all over the world around that. And I think that shows there is going to be potentials for globalized movements that the likes of which we've only saw with the Iraq war, the anti-Iraq war protests, where you had international protests of millions of people all over the globe at the same time, was one of the first times you ever saw that in world history. I think we're going to get a lot more of that around climate change partly because of social media, but it's going to be the old tools revived. I don't think it's going to be really a dramatically new equation.
When you talk about structure, I understand unions and all that, but you haven't mentioned cooperatives. And I just wondered, do they fall in, because that's a definite business structure that's, to my notion, it works much better than corporate ownership, in that it puts responsibility and ownership into the hands of the individuals that are directly involved in the endeavor.
So we in the movement ecology piece, in the movement ecology piece, we call those alternatives. But the problem is alternatives is that most alternatives in the United States are not being mobilized into changing dominant institutions in any way. So in Brazil, the MST, they run the organics movement, or the alternative agricultural sort of infrastructure for organics or alternative, agriculture, is run by the MST. Like, they're the biggest purveyors of that, and the most powerful is the Farm Workers Union, right? And they have, they mobilize for electoral work. They have a socialist vision in Brazil.
Spain too.
Yeah, but that's not the same in the United States. They're not the tip of the spear. They're not being mobile. We have woofers, thousands of people do temporary organic farming stuff. They're not politicized to become socialists or get involved electorally. So Hy-Vee, who here knows about Hy-Vee? Grocery store. Who knows about Hy-Vee grocery store? Is one of the largest cooperatives in the world.
Wow.
They're employee owned. They are conservative as hell. They support the Republican administration, right? So what we believe is that there is tons of potential for cooperatives to be radical, and we see that in other countries as something that builds structures. Alternatives and counterculture can build structure, but it needs to be interrelated. Those structures need to be interrelated around a common progressive vision with other people. And in the United States, we have not cracked that. There's people that are trying to figure that out, was Off the Mat, which is people organizing yoga studios to be politically engaged. Citizen Well is organizing the wellness community. A lot of middle-class young urban professionals sort of being organized around that, which I think is a very interesting thing. But and also there is potential. I'm helping organize sort of defecting evangelicals from the Trump coalition. That a lot of them, people of color, Latino or Latinx and Black evangelicals now, who want to become more progressive in a lot of ways. They want to embrace social justice. And there's lots of room right now for that. Most evangelicals we've lost, but there's a tiny bit that are defecting. And so there's lots of potentials of building alternatives. And I would say that's kind of alternative, because they're kind of an alternative culture.
Yeah, I got a question. So when I think of mass protests in that tradition, they're usually one coalescing event that people, or idea that people get around. And I'm doing some work right now around transformational change in our agricultural sector. And I've been viewing it mainly from an environmental perspective. We're losing clean drinking water, we're losing biodiversity.
Yes.
We're going to confront climate change, go down the list. But as you start to dig into that, you realize that system's underpinned by systemic racism, suppression of labor. So it's kind of hard to have a mass protest of we're going to do a labor, environmental, racism, sexism. It's that's a little long for the billboard pitch.
Yes, the laundry list.
Yeah, pretty much everything's messed up.
Yeah.
So how do you handle that without looking like you're ignoring? So we've been framing our things as an environmental movement, but then we have people whoa, do you not care about racism? And it's well, yeah, we do, but it's couldn't put it on the billboard. It's not that big enough. So how has that been handled before?
I think you are tapping into one of the biggest debates in this leftist social movements right now. And a lot of people that are trying to answer that question are represented by left-wing populism. I don't know if you're familiar with that. Jonathan Matthew Smucker is one of the intellectuals around that. Beyond the Choir is one of his firms. People's Action is really using what's called the race class narrative project, which is basically how do we frame things in a populist way that isn't a laundry list of like who's in and who's out. And that is a broad way. How do we polarize the public against the people, against the 1%, you know? And Bernie Sanders, I think, does a great job of that in the messaging. And I think that you can do that around, you can do the race class narrative project around different issues. And I disagree with people that a lot of times attack organizations for being single issue. I think you could do race class narrative project around agriculture and really focus around populist symbolic demands within that issue group, right? And I think that's the right way to go. But a lot of people on the left don't like that. They want you to have a laundry list and whatever. I don't think that's a good strategy. I think we need all these different parallel movements that are taking on different issues. But the common frame of race class narrative project is helpful because you can frame those issues in a way that talks about the elite basically screwing over agriculture. It's basically a way of talking about capitalism, talking about the elite and the 1% screwing over every sector of the economy and the environment. What else?